Welcome to another episode of Faith in Media podcast with me, Carla, your host. I am delighted to be joined today on our episode with the very famous, in my world particularly, Lauren Windle. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us today. It's so kind of you to grace us here. I would like to kind of go into the list of all of your accolades, but I think it's always best when our guests kind of introduce a little bit about themselves and kind of what you do. We're just waiting with bated breath to hear it.
So I'll just list my accolades in
Yes.
the most humble way possible.
Do it.
I'm an author. I've written 2 books, one on being single and dating in the church called Notes on Love, and one on feminism and the extent to which feminism and Christianity can overlap and intersect, called Notes on Feminism, being a woman in a male-led church. And then I've done bits and pieces of journalism. I used to work in tabloid journalism and for Premier, and more recently, I've presented still present Salt, the Christian dating apps online dating show, which is on their YouTube. And some other bits and pieces of presenting. And I'm also a commissioning editor for SPCK. So I work in publishing. So lots of all the things.
It is all the things, all the great things. And I think like already my mind is exploding with where I want to start with all of that. But I think one of my big questions is, how did you find yourself kind of in this space of writing and then finding the storytelling path around that?
Yeah, how did I? That is such a good question. I feel like so when I was younger, I worked in hospitality and I was in events and marketing. And I think just because they didn't particularly want to do it, but also because I was the only native English speaker in the office, to be honest, their English was so, like, it was a woman from Macedonia, a woman from Sweden, like their English was probably better than mine. But they were like, oh, it's your first language, so you write all of the marketing emails, the press release type stuff and stuff like that. So that was my first sort of touch point with writing after like English GCSE, which I did years ago. And I really liked it. And then when I left that job, I started writing a blog, and then I went into mainstream. I got my NCTJ, which is the qualification you need to work for national newspapers. And that took about 6 months. And then I went straight into tabloid journalism. And I think all of those stages were really important for sort of honing writing, because working in tabloid media, you realize that there's no wishy-washy, like, oh, it just hasn't come to me today, like you just write because that's your job, and they need copy by a certain time, and they don't want gaps in the newspaper, and you're fired if you don't do it. So I've got a real respect for deadlines and for writing and stuff like that. And then they taught me, doing the NCTJ taught me the law around it and the grammar and all of that sort of stuff. But I feel like God really opened up the door for the books, and actually then used those kinds of skills to talk about his church, to talk about him and Jesus and all of the other amazing things that are kind of part and parcel of Christian lifestyle.
I love that you kind of led in there, because that's perfectly a lovely, smooth segue into my next question. Is it sounds like your career was like you followed the steps. They were so clearly steps for you, and you're aware of that process when you reflect on it like you have just now. Did you feel that was kind of a clear call from God, or was it more of like an iterative process for you?
Oh, I'm just making it up as I go, Like,
I love that.
God never tells me the outcome, just the next step. So my assumption was that I would be in mainstream media. And my assumption when I went to training was that I would be in women's magazines, because I've seen How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days and all of those films where she's a features writer, and all of that stuff. And I had that dream for myself, as do many, many young women when they go into like writing and journalism. And actually, even when I wrote the first book, which is on being single and dating, my assumption was that I would pivot into mainstream. And hey, look, maybe I still will. It's not like my career's over, right? Hopefully. I mean, it depends on what I say in this podcast.
You're safe here, I'm sure of it.
But that certainly hasn't been the journey that God has taken me on. And I think that there's an argument for clear strategy, but God has only ever allowed me to have clear strategy to a point. Like if you ask me 10 years time, what will you be doing? I could make something up that sounds nice. I'd be very surprised if that's what God has it in line for me, because it just never has been in the past. But I've never regretted that. I love every single project, every single thing that's been given to me. So if it's so clear that he does it better, then why would I ask? You just keep going for the ride.
I think that's so important to hear, and it's encouraging to hear from someone like yourself that has had the journey that you have and the platform that you have, particularly for young and up and comers who want to step out into the career kind of
Mm-hmm.
platforms that you have, is to hear that there isn't always a direct path that looks very straight
Mm-hmm.
line. Very often, particularly those in kingdom culture, believers who have this faith, are like, it's going to be zigzag.
Yeah.
You might only get the step in front of you that might be visible for now, and
Yeah.
also what you think you're going to be using is not necessarily going to be realized in the way that you think it will, or the environment you think it's going to play
Yeah.
out. So
Yeah.
hearing that from you is so encouraging.
I mentor a woman, and we had lunch last week, and she was actually saying that she hadn't seen many examples of women in a Christian media space who weren't there by association of their husband. Because there were so many. Gosh, I just said something bad. She was like, from the people who she tends to engage with, you also know their husbands' names, and their husbands are also on those stages and on those platforms, and often have a bigger platform than their
Mm,
wives. And I think that if you scratch a bit below the surface, there are definitely those women. I mean, like, who knows what Priscilla Shearer's husband is called? Like, they
true.
definitely exist. But also, we can all name several women who have high profile husbands and therefore have a sort of platform off the back of their husband's career. So I think it's good to see particularly women moving into spaces and taking up space, just off their own back, and because they've asked for it and because they've said, hey, I've got something I'd like to share with you, rather than feeling the need to sort of have it handed to them or given to them by merit of their partner.
Mm. I love that you've raised that, and I think that's really something important to think about. And you've made me just reflect inside myself, and that's why I pulled that funny face. I'm just like, that's so true, and you don't realize how true that is in terms of the majority visibility of high profile women is normally in association with a male counterpart, somewhat.
Mm.
Um, and this leads really nicely, I think, into talking about your book that's just been released recently, Notes on Feminism, which really addresses kind of like a range of topics,
Yeah.
defining feminism, which I'll say this jokingly, that it seems to sound or kind of be received as a bit of a dirty word within Christian circles in some shape or form, because of the way that it's kind of utilized and weaponized actually in general
Mm.
society or in the media. And you
Mm.
really challenge some kind of stances on that within the church. What inspired you to explore those themes? Just hearing your last comment, I think, really kind of sets us really nicely in that
Yeah.
direction. So I'd love to hear from you about that.
What a beautiful dovetail we've created between.
Indeed.
um, yeah, I think, gosh, I feel like you're right. The church is very wary of the word feminism. I was too. I remember saying to someone in church, like, "Oh, I'm not a feminist," and they were like, "Well, but wouldn't you agree that women should be treated equally or paid equally or given the same opportunities?" And I was like, "Of course I would." And they were like, "Well, you were feminist then." I think a lot of it is confusion about the word. A lot of it is stigma around the word. A lot of it is an uncertainty about what you would be aligning yourself with if you aligned yourself with the word. And that's totally understandable. And the semantics of it are really not that important to me. But the idea that we as church are taking Jesus's lead by championing women, elevating them beyond the suppression that society shows them, is really important to me. And some people will call themselves womanists. Some people will say that they're fighting for equality or justice, or and there are loads of different versions that you can use if you don't like the word feminism because of other associations. But actually, I wanted to encourage Christians not to shy away from it, because there's real beauty in it, and the Bible demonstrates those values. Jesus demonstrates some of those values absolutely incredibly.
I love that you've raised that. Like, let's go back to really where this comes from. And you said, we've got one example. We say that we're championing kind of just like the head of our church. The prime example of all examples was in Jesus and the way that he conducted himself with women in society, which if you are aware of kind of what he was doing contextually in his time is so radical. And
Yeah.
yet somehow it feels like our Western culture and our belief that we're so, forward thinking, we've kind of lost that element, that we're fearful of words like feminism, and we're losing the essence of actually, can we see how that is somewhat connected? And I think I enjoy that in terms of how you describe that, because your book doesn't tell people what they should think. It rather addresses, can we just have some information about how we're processing how we get there? And that's a really tough balance to have. How did you manage to navigate that?
Well, I think I realized that there was no point speaking in absolutes because, like, I'm just not sure that I'm right about everything. And like, I would be blown away if I get up to heaven and God like pushes through the crowd and he goes, "You know what, Lauren? Oh, I'm so good to see you because all this time, every issue, all the Christians have debated, all full baptism or sprinkling or, we managed to disagree about everything. But time after time, Lauren, you just knew my heart. You had me bang on one after one after one. You nailed it, right? That's just not going to happen."
It might happen, Lauren. It
Yeah,
might.
I might be the only one who's literally ticked every box the whole way through and just understood. Like, I'm doing my best. And I would never want to tell someone, "I believe this, so you should too." I've done some research. I've read the Bible. I've prayed about it. I've talked to a lot of people, and this is where I've landed. But I'll be real with you. This is where I've landed for now. I reserve the right to grow and learn and adjust and tweak and change. And actually, like, that the book represents my beliefs right now, but I wouldn't want to pigeonhole myself in the future. Like, I still want to hear other people's perspectives. And I think that a lot of people have perspectives without research. And I think that's a shame because this is important. And I think it's important to understand different sides without saying like, "Oh, well, if you're super liberal, then you don't really care about the Bible and your theology is really shaky and stuff. Or, "Oh, if you're super conservative, then you're just a misogynist who benefits from the power dynamic of subjugating people." Actually, those are two quite extremes. And there are people who are focused on love, who are focused on Jesus, who are focused on the Bible, who fall on both sides, not the extremes, but who fall on both sides of a lot of these debates around women in leadership, women's position in a family, male headship, things like that. That it is not that one side is evil or one side is theologically tepid or anything like that. Actually, we need to understand the full arguments on all sides before we start making our decisions. And this is just my contribution to that understanding, not my boom, here's the divine answer.
And I'm so grateful for that. And I think we need more, mindsets like what you shared, really kind of bringing contribution to the table. And I love how you prefaced just what you've said there in terms of like, I'm just sharing what with the state that I'm in now. I reserve the right to the reality of like humans change and evolve. I only know what I know right now. And I'm hoping that I will know more in a year, 2 years. Like, this is natural progression.
Yeah.
But we do have a tendency to like keep people in a box. Well, this is what you said. And there is that kind of, it's a bit of a tension between, well, you have a platform. So the influence that you carry is also got a responsibility when we're sharing those contributions in those spaces. I guess my question there would be like, how do you cope with that pressure? Because I think that takes a lot of bravery. I love that you've done such a beautiful job of really articulating, this is my position, please don't be threatened by it. It's just a contribution, but it still takes courage to put yourself in that fire. And I can't imagine how that must kind of come with some reception as well. So tell me how you navigate that space.
Yeah, I think that certainly I see criticism and pushback, and certainly actually less so criticism. There have been a few people who haven't really wanted to engage with the book publicly, and I understand that because it's contentious and that you wouldn't want to undermine your very valuable work by by endorsing or standing by something that just it's not your primary thing. Like you can muddy the waters of the work that you do by by getting on board with something too controversial. And I'm sure that there'd be instances where I would do the same. I guess I think that, and this probably comes from talking about addiction and recovery. So when I remember being very early in addiction. So I'm a recovering drug addict and alcoholic, just in case people listening don't know, because it hasn't come up up until now in the podcast. And that was the first thing I ever spoke about publicly. Not about being feminist or dating and being single. It was that. And I remember worrying, like, what would people I went to school with think? Like, what would, and I'd have to say stuff like about stuff in front of my parents and things like that. And I waited 4 years into my sobriety before I first spoke out. And by the time that I did, like, God had just switched a switch and I just didn't care. And it's not that, like, I'm not talking in like a Lawrence Fox way, like, I'll annoy you all and two fingers to you. I don't want to upset people. But if somebody hears my vulnerability and somebody hears my story and they choose to laugh or undermine or judge, then that's okay with me. And that can only be God, because I have classically been a very socially anxious, insecure, I took drugs because of it, person who really cared about being popular and what people thought of me. So that is definitely God bringing me through something. And I think from then on, it's like, well, if God wants me to say this, or if God is putting a message on my heart and is saying, like, hey, you've got a voice that can add here, then do it. And other people won't hurt, or you won't even notice. I try not to read comments and things like that, on like YouTube videos and stuff. So I don't read any comments on the dating show or anything. But yeah, I think it's partly my decision to not be embarrassed. Embarrassment is a choice, and I say no.
I love that. It is a choice. I refuse to feel it. Thank you very much. Be on your way. I'm so glad that you brought up, you said that your first kind of encounter with that public space of speaking out was I believe it was your TEDx talk, which I watched actually. And I was like, there's so much energy there. Firstly, I'm impressed to get that much content in such a short space of time, and it was delivered so beautifully. So well done for that. When you look back at that moment, kind of what do you feel that the message that you kind of brought to the table about addiction then is kind of like the same Lauren that you see now doing the same things and using her story to kind of empower people again?
Yeah, I think what people are most interested in when I talk about addiction is the testimony, is the addict story. And that's natural. There's a reason Jeremy Kyle was watched by so many people for so long. We love a good gritty story, makes us feel a bit better about ourselves, but also in a Christian sense, because obviously TED Talk is not a Christian platform. In a Christian sense, it's that transformative power of Jesus. So you kind of have to know how deep and dark it goes in order to see the incredible transformation that I had. So I understand that. That TEDx talk was not on addiction, though. It was on recovery. And I'm rarely invited to speak on recovery these days. So I will often, if I'm doing a sermon or something, will talk about addiction and help people to identify if they're an addict and help people to work out, what that looks like and how they can support people around them and challenge sort of idolatry and make sure that doesn't get out of hand. And then I'll say, like, I don't have time within this talk to talk you through like what recovery looked like for me, but I've done this TED talk and I'd love you to listen to it. So it's not a talk I've done much since, to be honest. And I think I could push it more, but really what people want is the story, and then also the challenge for themselves to stay close to Jesus, to not put anything other than him on the throne, to not desensitize or distract yourself with things. But I really stand by that talk, and I'm so proud of it. And like, considering that was the first public speaking that I did, I look back on it and I'm like, I just want to give myself a massive hug, because I think it's funny, 6 years on now. So watching it back 6 years later, and thinking like that was very much where I sort of crossed the Rubicon and started and was Googleable and publicly in recovery and an advocate for recovery and things. And also it was before this sober, curious movement that's really swept through social media and stuff like that. And I took my time to talk about it publicly. And I remember sitting down with my bosses in the newspaper I worked in saying, look, I've been invited to do this TED talk and I want to do it, but I would be outing myself as a drug addict. Do you have any concern about that? And they were like, absolutely not, go and do it, which was amazing. But it took, I followed God's lead on it and took my time. And these days I see women in media are always encouraged to use their pain as part of to sell their pain for stories. And I think that that's really, really sort of seeped into this sober, curious movement, because you see women like setting up an Instagram account being like, hey, it's your girl, Joni, I'm 4 days sober, follow along with my journey. And you're like, don't do that, love. Put your phone away and take, this is going to be really, especially if you're coming from a place of addiction, this is going to be like ripping your skin off every day. Do not share this with the world. Give yourself the space, heal, and then talk about what you've learned from the journey. Don't share the journey as you're going through it. And that's very much what I did. And I think that was very much led by Jesus.
That's incredible. And I love how you spoke about that, because also what you're talking about is there's a time and a place. There's a reverence for the process. And not everything is necessarily for the social media platform. It's not for visibility's sake. You can talk about it in hindsight, but make sure that you're actually okay. And I feel like a lot of, social media is propelling, and like you say, it's perpetuating this image that actually is just really helpful to those that are really looking for resource or looking for support or looking for models or examples to follow, who feel that they can identify with that process. I'm really glad that you speak about that. And yet you use social media a lot to speak about your work. Do you feel that kind of we have a respect for it? It seems to me that you have got a good balance on that coming through the journey that you've had. Do you think that's something that we'll be able to retain somehow? Because right now, with everything just blowing up with social media and how people are navigating any kind of career progression, it's on this platform of social media, very public.
Yeah, I think that we're confused about authenticity and what it is. And we think that if we're holding something back, we're being inauthentic. Whereas I would say what you see of me on social media is 50% of my life. And that 50% is truly me. That is my work. That is my sense of humor. That is, my passion for single people or women and Jesus, and that's there, right? But there's a whole other 50% that I don't believe needs to be online. And I don't think that means I'm not being authentic. I think that means that I'm being sensible about what I share. And if I wasn't on social media for work, I wouldn't be on social media, full stop, I think. I find it to be a very important platform for talking about the messages that God has put on my heart. But you'll rarely see me hey, just having this brunch, here's my avocado, occasionally maybe, but actually I like to have a life that isn't online, as well as so much of my work and my professional life being on there. And that's fine. That's great. But I don't, I think I've got quite clear boundaries, which means I'm able to structure myself and protect myself to an extent in a way that particularly younger people coming up in their careers, they feel that if they don't share everything, then what are they sharing? They don't have a message. I think it's a messaging, a purpose issue often.
And I can see how that kind of translates, and the difference is, I think, almost just between one generation to another. So I was in the generation growing up through school, we didn't have any of this platform kind of visibility. Like, that's just not what we had. And yet we have young people who have now become adults, but this was actually the world that this is the only world that they knew.
That's so sad that no one had that life with, not no one, obviously we did. So my first phone was when I was 14, and there was no internet on it or anything. I had Snake, the little line that got the dot, and that was really cool. I'm so sad for people that they don't have that experience. Like me and my friends, when we did our makeup, it was like, it was the blind leading the blind. Blue mascara, blue
So
mascara,
good.
crimped.
Glory years, Lauren. Those were glory years. Like, I don't, when people, they don't know what it was like to look awkward. And because now
Yes.
it's very different, the encouragement to look a lot older than
Yeah,
your actual age. Like, be an awkward teenager. I had braces, frizzy hair, and an Alice band and really thick glasses, guys. This is my glory days.
absolutely.
I think there's something really precious about that. But thankfully, I didn't have to do it with everybody watching the reel of what that was like, as those images stay there, right?
Yeah.
We've spoken about, just in terms of, you have such a wonderfully broad range of spaces that you've occupied. There's journalism, you're an author, your face is public with regards to your presenting,
Mm.
SPCK. How do you find kind of the things that motivate you to occupy these spaces and continue to drive for them? What kind of gets you into those zones?
Um, Gosh, I guess what motivates me into those zones? That's such a good question. How am I going to answer it? I wonder. I'm very good at not procrastinating, I would say, and but only, yeah, I'm good at I'm good at pushing through when things get boring. And I think that my experience of a fun project, like writing a book or presenting a series, or, anything that takes anything that takes more than a day, right? Is that it's really exciting for the first 10%, and then really boring for the middle 80%, and then really exciting for the last 10% again. And I think that being able to push through the middle 80%, and I think faith is really important in that, because I see
Mm.
myself as a servant, not like, oh, I'm only sticking around when it's fabulous. Like, no, actually, I think that the hard work is valuable, and it forms you, and that's where the character comes from, right? So I guess that's, but what motivates me through the boring? I guess it's, yeah, God. Is that an allowed answer? Is that a bit
It's allowed. And
broad?
it works really well, because I guess one of my questions was going to be next, in terms of, we've seen and we've discussed about just kind of your journey, your first public appearance with TEDx. That was
Yeah.
something very specific about your experience and your journey in your experience with addiction and recovery. And now you're occupying different spaces, addressing very real societal issues within church community. And it feels like it's been such a specific journey, but one that you're willing to wholeheartedly embrace, even if the first step and the last step look very different. How has that kind of
Mm,
really molded your faith over time?
I think when it comes to my life, right? So, like, love life, I really struggle to hear from God. I mean, I'm sure I did write about this towards the end of Notes on Love, when I did a personal essay in there about my dating life. I really struggle to hear from God. I really, like, there's a part of me that sometimes feels like, well, where are you? Like, what's the point in all of this? I can't hear you. You're not talking to me. I've never felt that way in my career. And I think if I'd felt that way across the board, I would have had a real, like, crisis of faith. Like, hang on, but everyone says they hear God. I don't hear God. I do. I hear him so clearly.
Mhm.
I'm really certain of what decisions I need to make and when I need to make them. And I think that that's probably why I don't feel the need to sort of be working towards, like, a strategy, like, I haven't, and everyone, any business, any good, management consultant will tell you, you need to know where you're going in order to get there, to achieve your goals. Well, I've achieved lots of goals,
Mm.
so I'm kind of just on for the ride now. And I'm here. I'm like, I'm my hands, my feet, my mouth. It's often my mouth I have to use, just to talk and tell people things. And I'm ready for wherever God takes me next. And I think it's strengthened my faith, knowing what I had in mind for my career versus what God gave me. And it's sort of flexing that muscle and building that muscle of stepping out and doing what you're told, basically. Because at first it was just little things, and now it can be something quite big, like, no, that's an amazing opportunity, but turn it down, you know. And actually it takes time to get to the point where you're like, oh no, I'm really quite sure that's what God wants for me. I wouldn't want anything in my career that I didn't feel God was leading me into. And when he does, he just shows up so amazingly. That it's just really exciting.
That's amazing. You have so much energy. I feel like it's contagious. And I think anyone that comes across this conversation is like, I want to be her. She executes. She hears, she executes. That's a huge deal. I think particularly those that are stepping out or looking to step out into kind of some of the platforms that you've occupied, that's important to hear that. Sometimes it's not a big strategy. And I love that you've really highlighted that. But what you have done is wholeheartedly and with gusto embrace every step that has been made clear to you. And some of us, I would say us, because I definitely have had moments where in some of the platforms that I'm like, is this you? Is this not you? Go and see, exhaust it. If he's really there, he'll confirm it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And not be afraid to take that risk. And if your heart is truly in the right place, which is what it sounds like, you've always submitted it there. To, is this where you want me to be, God? How can I serve you? And I think that's a huge element too. Like, there's so much grace in that space too. And I love that you're like, I've heard, I'm executing, I've heard, and we need to get more of that. We need to be more like Lauren. That's all I think.
Oh no. Oh, I can't carry that. That's I was talking to a friend. We went for coffee, and he ordered like some fancy coffee. He was like, "Yeah, when I was a barista in a coffee shop, and I think he'd done it like at uni for some money." And he was like, "Yeah, I was rubbish. I gave it nothing. I was like, I did the bare minimum to get by." And I worked in a bar in my gap year. And that's maybe not a very good example because that was pre-faith and it was all a bit dodgy and drinky. But I look through every job I've had, both pre and post my sort of new conversion to Christianity, and I really gave everything to each of those jobs. And like when I first was at the newspaper, I remember I knew I was going to leave to do a master's, and obviously you apply to do a master's well in advance, and I was accepted onto it 9 months out from when I would be starting. So I handed in my notice 9 months before because I knew I was being considered for a promotion, and I wanted it to go to one of the other people on the desk who wouldn't be just leaving straight away. Not that it would have been straight away. I would have gotten like a good 6 months out of it. So I made that really clear. And I was always described as having real integrity. And I think that meant people gave me more opportunities and opened up doors for me. And I've never been like my mate, the barista. Like when I came out of my degree, so I did that degree. I did a master's in addiction studies in 2018, and in 2019 came out and was like, right, God, what next? I've got this degree. Am I going to be, and I interviewed to be like the head of PR for the Alcohol Health Alliance, which would have been a very amazing, prestigious job. And I interviewed for loads of like really big, like affecting policy on alcohol and think tanks and this. And then all of those doors closed. And I thought, right, I'll go back to journalism. And they didn't have space for me on my desk again. They were like, Lauren, I'd hire you in an instant, but we've just made budget cuts. I can't do it. So, okay, so what am I going to do? And then I was chatting to my vicar at a prayer meeting, and he was like, we need a receptionist and we've got no good applicants. And I was like, do you know what? You keep belly aching about this. Pray and just message 5 people in the church and be like, I don't care if they're the CEO of Google or Apple. You don't know what God's doing in their heart. And just say, would you consider applying for this role? We want someone from within the church and we think you'd be great. And he was like, okay, I'll pray about it and do that. And obviously like 2 hours later, ding, I get the message like, we think you'd be great for this role. Would you consider it? And I was like, oh, cute. Obviously not. I'm like quite an important person, you know, like I'm a journalist. I have big articles out. I like chase the story and do funny things and present, and, you know, how sweet of him. So I replied like, okay, I'm going to think and pray about it for 2 days because I wanted to show him the respect he deserved. But I had no intention of thinking and praying about it for 2 days. I was going to just wait 2 days and message him and be like, no, thanks. But I prayed about it. I did pray about it in the end. And God was like, that's your job. And I was like, oh, no, 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 no. I do not think so. And it turns out it was my job, and I accepted the job. And I really wanted to do it well. And I wrote like a 30-page document for the person coming in next to make sure, because I only did it for 6 months, to make sure that they knew every in and out of how to be the best assistant to the vicar, how to run the building best. Like, I would clean the toilets. I made sure he got the right post-it notes that he wanted, that concertina had instead of pulled off because they were his favorite. Like, yeah, I'll do it all. And I actually, it was really humbling and great. And it was the space to pray and think and be in a really gentle working environment that I'd never had before, being in newsrooms. And it was like quite, and even it was quite a fancy church that had an operations director, right? So I reported to her, and then there was the vicar as well, who I also reported to, but sort of separately. And she was so pastoral with me, and was really took time to hear how I was doing. And I think I really needed that at the time, and God knew that. But I went on a date in that time, and the guy, who I'm not seeing him now, but we were on that date, and he was like, what do you do for work? And I felt in my stomach this knot, and all I wanted to do was be like, yeah, I'm a features writer for a national newspaper. But I was like, I'm a receptionist at my church. And he was like, that's so cool, what does that look like? And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't correct it. I just, because it was correct, but I never said, but I'm only doing this for a short amount of time. Super important. I've done all this studying, and I was just like, no, I'm a receptionist at my church. And I feel like God really challenged me in that time to do that job, do it really well, and you will be serving people immensely for me. And that's what I want from you.
I absolutely love your example there. And I think that's a huge testament to anyone that comes across this conversation, those that are aspiring to get to just paths that you're familiar with in terms of kind of your ascension into your career. Because when it comes to God-fearing people, he really wastes nothing, and what he's more concerned about is your character, and that he can trust you when he gives you a platform at a later date, which he will do. And I love what you said, sometimes this sounds or feels in such a role so far away from where I think you're taking me. I'm so my skills are so much more than what this looks like.
But I got that skill whilst I was on reception. I got that.
That's incredible. And I just wanted to completely reiterate that as well. Just never underestimate all God can do in that time. I love how you said as well, in terms of that was a place where someone took care of your heart too, the pastoral element, the gentle environment. You need that space so that sometimes to be really kind of agile and whole to take on what challenges you don't know is going to come across in the future, that God was already making sure you are so built and so ready. And it's such a spacious place before he put you onto that next level. Never underestimate what those unlikely kind of slots or, moments of transition can look like. Lauren, this has been an incredible conversation. I think we'll be here all day if I had my way, but you're a busy woman, and I will allow you the freedom to go on and do what you're doing, which has just been incredible. If you have come across this conversation, I could not encourage you more about making sure that you connect with Lauren. Follow all of her socials. She's on Instagram. If you want some more information, we will have this along the caption of this podcast. Go and find out about her book. Notes on Love and Notes on Feminism are available online and in bookshops. You've just been an incredible guest, Lauren. Thank you so much for gracing us with your time.
So much for having me. I've loved it.
Thank you, and God bless you, and we'll speak to you again soon. You've been listening to Faith in Media with Carla Adebekun. Make sure you catch our episodes and hit subscribe. Please share and leave us a comment. Christians in Media is a UK charity that supports, encourages and inspires Christians from across the ever-changing media landscape. Find out more at www.christiansinmedia.co.uk and connect with us via our socials.